Okay, hopefully you all can hear me. Again, this is Leroy Wade with the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. I'll be joined later on by Kelli Reed, a Senior Associate for Financial Aid, and then we will be kind of tag teaming the presentation as we go forward. But we're certainly glad to be here, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions about the financial aid programs. We really cover three major topics today. That's our plan anyway. Again, we want to talk a little bit about the budget. Obviously, that the changes in the budget since earlier in this year for FY21 are going to have a big impact on our programs. And so we'll spend some time doing that. I'll also do some program updates, kind of bring you up to date on any changes or things that are going on with specific programs. And then I'll turn it over to Kelli, and she will handle the COVID-19 accommodations that we've put in place for this fall. All right, in terms of our budget situation, as I said, things have really changed a lot since we started out this year. We started out with things looking pretty good and hoping that it was going to be a banner year with the economy going well. And then when COVID-19 hit, everything was off the table. And so we ended up that FY21 budget process in a much different place than we would have expected. In terms of the actual budget restrictions that the governor announced at the end of the year, Bright Flight was the only program that was affected by that. There were other impacts on our other programs, but they really came out of the legislative process as opposed to being a part of the gubernatorial restrictions. The difference there is maybe a very subtle one and may not in effect have a big impact. Restrictions that the governor puts in place can be temporary. And so if the economy improves and if revenue comes in higher than expected, there's at least a possibility that these restrictions might be reduced or eliminated. I don't think that's really terribly likely, but it is possible. The changes that were a part of the legislative process are different than that because they actually are in place. There's no way to undo those except to go back through the budget process for a supplemental, which we may do in a couple of instances. So anyway, with Bright Flight, again, we started out requesting a little over $24 million. That was a $500,000 increase to try and cover growth in the program. We were actually appropriated about $3.5 million less than that. Again, the legislature trying to balance the state budget. And then once that was passed at the end of June, the governor restricted about $6.5 million from that program, leaving us with about $13.7 million. As you can see, almost a $10 million reduction from what we would have expected. That has resulted in us having to reduce awards for the program. Again, for the last couple of years, we've been able to maintain the $3,000 statutory maximum for the top 3%. We're certainly not able to do that with this level of funding. So we've set the awards for this coming year, or for this current year, FY21, at $1,800. Again, we can reevaluate those later if those funds are released, but my expectation is that's where we'll be for the year. In terms of the 4th and 5th percentiles, which are actually eligible for this, they again will receive no award as there's not sufficient funding to fund that group. A plus is the next one. Again, we requested a $4.8 million increase for this program. It has continued to grow over the last several years. Again, and we were trying to be sure that we would cover the growth that we expected for this year, although for FY20, the program actually grew faster than we had anticipated. But we were only appropriated the same amount as we were for FY20, so we ended up with $41.1 million. We continue to believe that there's going to be more demand for this program. There's nothing that we can see that says that that's not going to happen. And because of the greater than expected growth in FY20, we ended the year without any carryover funds. Typically, for the summer term, we use funds that we carried over from the prior year to handle the cash flow for that. That money is not there this year, and so that will also be coming out of the current year, FY21. Exacerbating this shortfall kinds of situations. I think we can expect we're still reviewing this, and so there's no final decision at this point, but I think it's likely that we'll see some limit on the number of credit hours that will be reimbursed for this program. We're going to try and get information out about that as soon as we possibly can, but again, we're still trying to review the data and run the traps on that to make sure we've got everything in place and that we can get good information out to everyone. Just as an aside, many of you know that there was a couple of years ago, there was passed into statute an A+ connected dual credit, dual enrollment scholarship. There was no funding appropriated for that program for FY21. And in addition, given the current funding situation for the existing program, there is really no funding available for that dual credit, dual enrollment scholarship. Access Missouri, again, this is our major, our need-based program. We had requested a $7 million increase for that program. That's part of an effort on our part to try and move this program closer to full funding, which would be about $110 million. So this was an attempt to try and move toward that goal a little bit. Unfortunately, we were unable to get that, and in fact, this program was reduced by $2.5 million from the FY20 funding level. An additional complication here is that in a normal year, we would get a transfer from the Gaming Commission of about $5 million to help fund the Access Missouri program. Given that the casinos were closed for an extended period of time and during this spring, it's unclear whether there are going to be sufficient funds to make that transfer. And so that's another piece of the unknown here. As we've looked at what we can do here, we've been leaving that kind of off the table, not expecting that funds. If it comes in, that will help. But it's a tough situation that FAFSA filing was down, but it has helped us since we are getting less money, frankly. We've reduced awards, the estimated awards now from 75%, which is where they were in FY20, down to 70%. That's about a $2,000 award at a 4-year institution, both public and independent, and at State Technical College, and then a $910 award at 2-year institutions. And we did extend the deadline to April 1st. You may remember that we have kind of a dual deadline process now where any application or FAFSA that's filed by February 1st is guaranteed an award, not guaranteed a certain amount, but guaranteed an award. And then we review our available funding and the number of applicants we receive to determine if we can move that deadline. And for this year, we were able to move it to our old deadline of April 1st. We're still continuing to look at this. We've had some changes in terms of the data. And so we will, I don't anticipate we'll make big changes, but we will be re-reviewing that next month, and final awards will be announced before we open the fall certification cycle. A Fast Track program is our newest program. Again, it's only been in place a year and a little bit more. We requested a $24.4 million appropriation for that program. That would be a $10 million increase from what we got in FY20, and was essentially the amount that the fiscal note for the legislation estimated the program would cost. We only received $3 million in funding. That was $7 million less than we got in FY20. The situation isn't quite as dire as that looks because we were able to carry over some funds from the prior year. But again, our funding, we believe, is going to be pretty limited for this program. One of the positive things is that we were able to get some additional funding sources as a part of that program. Last year, it was funded strictly by lottery, and as a consequence, only public institutions and students attending public institutions were eligible. That has changed with this appropriation, which includes some general revenue and some emergency funding. The GEAR there stands for the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund, and so we do have funds, and we'll be able to bring the independent institutions in, although funding will be very limited for those programs. In terms of how we're going to approach awards, again, we anticipate we'll provide full awards until the funds are depleted, but we do have to keep in mind that renewal students have priority. That's a statutory provision, and so we'll need to ensure that any renewal students from last year are paid, and then we will pay others as we have funding available. Next slide, please. In terms of our other programs, the main one I want to mention here is Ross Barnett, because that has been our part-time program for a number of years. That program was implemented back in the 80s. It was viewed, however, as being duplicative of the Fast Track program. And so there have been moves to eliminate this program. We have been working with the legislature to try and soft land it, basically to wind the program down over a number of years, so students would have the chance to make other plans. Unfortunately, with the economic disruption that occurred, the decision was made by the legislature to eliminate this funding. And so FY20 was the last year that there will be a Ross Barnett program. In our other programs, our smaller and benefit programs, funding was flat for all of those. The only item there I would pay attention to, or I would draw your attention to, I should say, is the dual credit scholarship. There are 2 dual credit scholarships in statute. This one is not tied to A+. It's a freestanding program. Unfortunately, it did not receive funding either. So now I'll move on and talk a little bit about some program updates, some changes that have been occurring in our programs over time, and new things that are occurring and things that we're looking at as we look to the future as well. So update. For the A+ scholarship, we had a couple of administrative rule revisions that are in place. Again, these administrative rules are guidelines for how the program is administered and set the requirements for what everyone, including us, must do. The first one was a result of legislation that occurred a couple of years ago that changed the requirement for enrollment at a A+ high school. Prior to this legislation, the student had to be enrolled in an A+ high school for the 3 years immediately prior to graduation. And that was causing some problems for some students that had opportunities to do some other things during one of those 3 years. And so the legislation was changed to allow it to be any 3 years. So it could be freshman, junior, senior, it could be any of those 3. The student did have to graduate from an A+ high school. However, that was kind of overwritten then by legislation in the next legislative session, where it created some changes in the program in order to accommodate the dual credit, dual scholarship component that was being added to the program. And so the 3 years was reduced to 2 years, again, that being the requirement. So a student for that dual credit scholarship would have to be in a high school that's A+ designated for at least 2 years, but it also applies to the post-secondary student. And it can again be any 2 years. And then verification that the grade point requirement is at the end of each term for post-secondary students. So again, that was a provision that was added, I think, really with the dual credit scholarship in mind, but the way it was added, it applied across the board, both to the dual credit and the post-secondary components of the program. For the Bright Flight program, we're watching a couple of things with regard to that program. One is, I've been saying for the last couple of years that there's every likelihood that at some point in the near future, we're going to see a score change. Again, we are seeing that creep up each year. And so I think there's at least some likelihood that for the 2022 seniors, we could see that score change to a 32 from a 31 in terms of the cut score. So we're continuing to watch that, and the announcement will be made well prior to that, those seniors entering college or entering their senior year, so that they will have the opportunity to take the ACT test and get that higher score if that does occur. The second item that we're watching as well is relates to the announcement that ACT made earlier this year that they were going to begin publishing an official super score for folks that are taking the ACT test. Again, if you're not familiar with super score, that's basically they will take the highest score on each of your subtests, combine those, and make that your composite score, as opposed to the way it's been done in the past, where each test taking actually stands independently, and your composite score is based on that one test sitting. And so we've never allowed super scores in the past for eligibility, but we are reviewing that now since it's now become the official policy of ACT, and we need to take a stronger position in terms of whether this counts or not for the Bright Flight program. And finally, our Fast Track program, as I mentioned, is our newest financial aid program. Its initial year was in 1920. It's primarily intended to be for adult students, those 25 and above, but younger students can be eligible for the program if they've been out of school for at least 2 years. It is a need-based program. Again, you can see the AGIs here. The AGI requirement depends on what your tax filing status is. If you're filing a joint return, it's $80,000, and any other tax filing status, the cutoff is $40,000 in terms of the adjusted gross income. The important thing, or one of the important things to keep in mind for this program, is that it is a grant that converts to a loan because there is an employment requirement involved. If students don't fulfill the obligation of that employment, if they receive the grant and then they don't fulfill that work obligation, which is 3 years of residency and employment full-time in the state of Missouri, then either all or some portion of that grant will convert to a loan that has to be repaid. As the slide indicates, it's reduced by 1/3 for each year of employment. So if you work for 3 years, obviously it's all forgiven. If you work some piece of that 1 year, then 1/3 would be reduced. And again, if it does convert to a loan, it has to be repaid with interest as well. So we are working on this program, continuing to stand it up. It's up and running and all of that, but we're trying to automate the pieces kind of behind the scenes so that it works more efficiently and more effectively. There are a number of things that will impact, including the payment process. It'll allow us to reduce the amount of time from 1 month to about 1 week in order for those payments to occur. Again, the thing to keep in mind is because this can convert to a loan, there are a number of truth in lending requirements that we have to provide to students so that they are informed consumers. And that can often slow down this process. So that's the part that we're trying to get automated. Okay, I'm going to take a break now, and I'll hand this off to Kelli Reed, who's going to take you through the accommodations that we made in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, Kelli?
Thank you. The accommodations that I'm going to cover are the accommodations that we put into place for the 2020 seniors, as well as the post-secondary students who were wanting to renew the award for the 2021 academic year. We are still in the process of thinking about accommodations for the 21 seniors. It's still very early in the process, and we need to be sure that we are helping the students in the best way possible. And so we're kind of waiting for events to unfold before we have an idea of exactly how we can best help the 21 seniors. So we don't have any accommodations for them yet, but we are continuing to look at that, and we'll make an announcement about any 21 senior accommodations as soon as we can. So for the 20 seniors and the general provisions apply to the post-secondary students. A general rule of thumb for the post-secondary students is that if the students were eligible for payment when their school closed or began an alternative delivery method, then they could receive the funding. Normally there's a 10 business day verification period that has to occur either before the school requests the funds or after they receive the funds. But in light of COVID-19, we waived that verification period, and so the students would be eligible for payment if they were eligible at the time of closure or the alternative delivery method. We also had to put a provision in place for students enrolled in 8-week sessions. In many instances, either the student didn't attend the 8-week session or the school had closed before that 8-week session began. We said that as long as the student was enrolled full-time for both sessions, that they could receive the funding even if they weren't actually there in the second 8-week session. With the 2.5 cumulative grade point average, typically that is required to renew awards. With the COVID-19 accommodation, we said that students would be eligible as long as they were meeting the institution's definition of satisfactory academic progress, which a lot of institutions typically have less than a 2.5 cumulative grade point average tied to their satisfactory progress policy. So as long as students were meeting their institution's policy, then they can renew. Now, whether that accommodation applies to the fall only or to the full academic year depends on whether the 2.5 cumulative grade point average was required by statute or required by regulation. We have more flexibility in regulatory requirements than we do for statutory requirements. With the statutory requirement, we had to actually go to the governor's office and get permission to provide the accommodation. That permission was granted for the fall-only semester, and so for the Access, Bright Flight, Fast Track, and Wartime Veteran Survivor Grant programs, the accommodation only applies for fall. For all of our other programs, with a few exceptions, it does apply for the full academic year. The exceptions are the advanced placement incentive grant. To be eligible for that, students have to receive either A+ or Access Missouri. So the accommodation for advanced placement depends on which of those two programs the student qualified under. And then the other exception is the Public Safety Officer Survivor Grant. An accommodation wasn't necessary for that program because the definition of satisfactory progress was already just as defined by the institution. There was no specific grade point average tied to that. Moving on to the A+ accommodations for the 2020 high school seniors, we had said that if your school calculated a grade point average, then the student could have either a 2.5 at the end of fall or at the end of spring. Either one would qualify. Some of the schools, however, went to a pass-fail grading system, and for those schools, we said that it would be the cumulative grade point average at the time the in-person classes halted or at the end of the third quarter, whichever made the most sense for the particular school that went to the pass-fail grading system. There were also some testing disruptions, both with the end-of-course exam and with the ACT, and so we ended up waiving the Algebra 1 EOC requirement for the 2020 seniors. With the tutoring or mentoring requirement, we realized that especially schools that had a class in place for students to meet that was going to be very difficult for those students to do. So we reduced the requirement from 50 hours down to 25. There are some exceptional circumstance extensions that are allowed under normal circumstances, and that basically says that students, if the school allows and determines on a case-by-case basis that they can have up to 6 months beyond high school graduation in order to fulfill that tutoring or mentoring requirement. That exceptional circumstance extension was also still available to help the students even meet the 25-hour requirement. We also encouraged schools to look at flexible ways to meet that requirement. And so, but if you were going to do that, we did ask that you make policy revisions, either temporary revisions or permanent revisions, to say this is what we will allow students to do to meet that tutoring or mentoring requirement. For the 95% attendance requirement, it was still a requirement that was not waived or really accommodated in a major way. The calculation was still to be based on the high school policy. It was to be based on the total coursework in which the student was enrolled, regardless of the delivery method in the fourth quarter. However, we did say that under normal circumstances, schools can have an appeal process to help students meet that 95% attendance for health reasons. We said that a blanket appeal for COVID-19 could be put in place, but it had to be applied consistently to all A+ students. That's why it's blanket. It has to be for everyone, not just for a student or two. With the verification of A+ eligibility, we always prefer a stamped transcript. However, in this particular situation, we realized that not all A+ coordinators would have access to the physical A+ stamp in order to stamp that transcript. So we said that a letter could be substituted if it was on school letterhead, included verbiage specified in the e-distribution message that we sent out, and was signed by the principal or A+ coordinator, and included the typed name and title of the signatory. So as long as that letter was stamped or was attached to the transcript, that would work as well as the stamp, even though the stamp was preferred. For post-secondary students, again, there was the renewal GPA was based on satisfactory academic progress as defined by the institution, so that the GPA could be less than 2.5. However, we did say that it would only apply to students who were eligible for an award in the 2019-2020 academic year. So if a student went in 2018-2019, skipped 2019-2020, when they came back for 2021, they would have to have a 2.5 GPA. The same would be true if a student lost eligibility in 2019-2020. They would have to have the 2.5 GPA in order to renew as well. There are full-time enrollment and completion requirements that post-secondary students have to meet. Originally, we had gone out and said that and linked the eligibility to all available hours, which is an exception to full-time enrollment that we allow. However, after we got some questions and thought about it, we realized that the all available hours exception really didn't meet the needs of the students. And so we went out with additional guidance that said that students would be eligible or would be considered to have met both the full-time enrollment and the completion requirement if they were eligible at the time of closure or when the school converted to the alternative delivery method. And then, of course, we clarified that any coursework for which the student was eligible for reimbursement at the time of closure or conversion could still be reimbursed. There were also a couple of accommodations related to the fast track program. The accommodation is the same for both situations. We need to know the total hours enrolled to determine whether or not the student is enrolled at least half-time. Full-time enrollment is not required for this program. They do have to be enrolled at least half-time. And then we also, since it is a tuition-based award, have to know how many hours a student is enrolled in order to calculate the award amount. So in those two instances, we said that the hours would be based on the number of hours in which the student was enrolled at the time of the closure or when the school changed to an alternative delivery method. And that's all we have for you today. Our contact information is here. We do have 2 financial aid specialists that are very knowledgeable. My contact information is there as well. So if you have any questions or there's anything we can do to help, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Leroy and Kelly. We're going to start our live Q&A now. And what I will do is read questions that we've received through our chat box, and we'll ask Leroy and Kelly to respond to those questions verbally. So the first question is the current Bright Flight ACT composite score requirement 32 or 31? And what is the expected change for the class of 2021 and 2022?
Okay, that's an easy one, so I'll go ahead and take that one. Again, the current score is a 31 or above. That's the cut score for the for the 2020 seniors. That will also be the requirement for the 2021 seniors as well. So for the current set of seniors that are going in to college this fall, and for the seniors next year, the 31 will continue to be the score. We're still looking at the data in terms of the 2022 seniors. If it changes, I expect it will go to a 32. I think it's going to go up, not down. But again, we just don't know what that's going to look like or what kinds of changes may be being made, and that would impact those score levels. So it's something that we will announce early next year, again, so that those 2022 seniors have at least their entire senior year and maybe even part of their junior year to retake the test or to do something to try and up their score so that they can meet that.
Thank you, Leroy. Our next question, will ACT be offering section retesting this fall for the class of 2021?
I guess I'll go ahead and take that one too. That's my understanding. I checked the ACT website a few days ago, and it's my understanding they are going to go forward with that. in the very near future. I don't know exactly when that will kick in, but that would be it. You would take the full test, and then you could take section tests after that, and that would be, those scores would then be used to establish that super score that I mentioned.
Thank you, Leroy. Is it likely for colleges to change ACT requirements for financial aid scholarships like they have done with admissions?
I think that's a really difficult question for us to answer. Again, I think each individual institution is going to have to make a decision, just as they've done with the admission requirements, whether they will apply that to their financial aid programs. In our instance, we don't really have that flexibility. For the Bright Flight, for example, the provisions are provided in statute. The score can change based on the test takers, but we can't really do away with that requirement or change it without going to the legislature and getting that kind of a change.
Missouri A+ requirements for 2021 are the same as the past. That is, the accommodations made for COVID were temporary. Is that correct?
That is correct. Again, but I would say that we are continuing to evaluate the situation. Again, what this fall is going to look like in many instances is still up in the air, much less what the rest of the academic year might look like. So I want to be clear that we are monitoring that situation. We're working with DESE and our other folks to try and assess that situation, and that we're willing to make additional accommodations. We just want to wait and see what the situation is so that those accommodations are the right ones and achieve the goal that we really have in mind. So I just want to be clear that we are continuing to look at that. We're not closing the door on it forever.
Thank you. Another question, can a Missouri college reduce state aid if outside scholarships or aid is factored for tuition and costs?
That really depends on the situation. Generally, it would depend on whether or not the student was at cost of attendance, was meeting full cost of attendance. If they are, that certainly could be the case, that it could be reduced in that kind of an instance. Otherwise, generally, if a student is eligible for an award for Access Missouri, for example, $2,000, that student would get the full $2,000 regardless of other aid, again, unless that took them up and put them above the cost of attendance requirement.
Thank you, Leroy. The class of 2020 seniors who earned Bright Flight are being awarded $1,800 instead of $3,000. Is that correct?
That is correct. Again, that's a response to the situation I described early in the presentation, where we have about $10 million less in the program than we anticipated we would need. And so we had no other choice than to reduce those awards in order to balance the budget, if you will.
Thank you, Leroy. We received a question about MassFAP, but we'll respond to that question via chat. Here's another question. Returning college students who earned Bright Flight, are they also awarded the $1,800?
Yes, it's the same across the board, whether the student is a renewal student or an initial student. So yes, the award is $1,800 for everyone.
Thank you, Leroy. Another question. I was confused about A+ rule revisions. I thought I heard that dual enrollment, dual credit money was being cut for 2021. Can you clarify?
Sure. Again, in terms of the changes that were made, there were a number of changes made to the program in order to accommodate the addition of the dual credit, dual enrollment scholarship. But there are, in terms of, so a number of things I mentioned, like the 2-year requirement, the reduction to a 2-year requirement is really related to that dual credit, dual enrollment component of that program. In terms of funding, we had requested a separate appropriation for the dual credit, a dual enrollment scholarship. Because of the way it's structured, that's really the best way to try and fund that requirement, and lets us distribute the funds in a more timely fashion. That appropriation was not successful. It was zeroed out. There is, at least potentially, the option that if there were leftover money in the program, that could be used for the dual credit, dual enrollment scholarship. That's not a good way to do it. That would mean that it would be late in the year, May or April or May, before we would even know whether we had any money. But even that option is cut off for FY21 because we just don't believe there's going to be enough money in the program, at least potentially, to pay all of the post-secondary students. So there will be no money in that program for the dual credit, dual enrollment scholarship.
Thank you, Leroy. Okay, have a question here. Sounds like there needs to be a plan to get additional funding. What do you suggest in terms of advocacy and visits to Jefferson City?
Okay, well, I have to be careful about, I'm not a lobbyist or a registered lobbyist or anything that closely represents a lobbyist. But I've got two things to say. One is there's every likelihood, again, we're working on budget decisions for 22 right now, and that also includes questions about FY21 supplemental appropriations. And so in both of these instances, both for Bright Flight and for A+, we're looking at the possibility and the options available to request supplemental funds for the current year. Now, will that be successful? It's all going to depend on what the economy looks like as time goes forward. Certainly, we're going to ask, as our regular request for 22, to fully fund both of those programs again. So that's essentially the approach that we're taking. In terms of advocacy, again, I think support for our financial aid programs is incredibly important. Legislators are always interested in hearing what folks that are on the front lines are doing, whether that's those of you that work at the post-secondary level or at the secondary level. So I would, again, you need to do that in the context of your organization's policies. Is it appropriate for you to do certain kinds of activities? But as long as you're within that, I would certainly, we would appreciate any support that you can provide for making sure these programs are appropriately funded.
Thank you, Leroy. Another question. When will our class of 2020 and 2021 students know how much aid they will receive for Missouri A+?
Well, I'm hopeful that we will have that information out within the next, certainly within the next week or two. I'm pushing right now to try and get that finalized. So we're going to get something out as soon as possible. I would say, and again, there has not been a final decision made yet. So I don't want this to appear that there has, but it would be my interpretation that what we would probably do is whatever that limit is would just be applied in the spring semester. Students that are in summer and fall would receive their normal amounts, and any limitation would occur in the spring. So that accomplishes two things. One, that gives those families a little bit of time to be able to try and prepare for that shortfall if it occurs. It also gives us the opportunity to seek a supplemental, and if we are successful, we can put that in place in that spring semester and make those students whole. So that's how I would envision that rolling out. But I think we'll have something more definitive within the next week or two.